Kia ora tēnā koutou. Ko Jessica Hutchings ahau, ko ai he uri o Ngai Tahu me Ngāti Huirapa. Kei tahi atu taha no India, tōku mama no Gujarati ia. Kei te noho au kei konei, kei te tahi pāmu iti, ko Papa Whakarito. So I hail from the tribe of Ngai Tahu down in the South Island, Te Waipounamu in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And on the other side, I'm from Gujarat, India. Sometimes I'm known as a Mindian, a Māori Indian. And I live on a little whanau food farm, little family food farm, just north of Wellington, capital city, with my wife Jo, my dog Tahi, and my mum who lives in a little whare just over there in the house next door. So I've been on this whenua, on this land, for about 16 years now. And when we first came out to it, it was a total bare block of land. And when I say bare block, it had dairy cows on it for probably a long time. This little valley actually supplied Wellington with milk. And so there's a shed over there, which is the remnants of the old milking shed. And so a developer bought it, pretty common story in Aotearoa with land, a developer bought it and divided it up, and we bought one of the first lots. And so literally when we came up here, there were cows up here and it was just pasture. And so we have spent all our time regenerating, or what we would say recloaking papa tuanuku. So recloaking Earth Mother back in native trees, or back in her children, back in her rākau Māori, so planting native trees back on the whenua. We're on the we're in a rohi which still has the remnants of Māori land owned by the Wellington Tenth Trust, just down one side of the road up there. And so it's really important for us as Māori who don't live in our own tribal areas, because we're from the South Island and our little farms in the North Island, that we are really clear about that relationship of being manuhiri on somebody else's tribal whenua. So although we're Māori, we're actually visitors in somebody else's tribal area. So, we have rangitane, we have kahununu, we have the Wellington Tenth Trust descendants from Taranaki whānui. So this area was a place where many tribes walked through and travelled through, and there are, as I've been told, there are really significant cultural sites further up the valley up there. And it was really important for me to understand the Whakapapa, or the history, the cultural landscape of this whenua before even considering purchasing it. So we are not on traditional intergenerational papakainga land. This is land that's kind of bought under that colonial land tenure system of private ownership. But we live on this land like we're living in a papakainga, like an intergenerational situation. Yeah, so I've got mum, my partner, is kind of like an open house, and my son and his girlfriend and other whānau members spend a lot of time up here as well. So, yeah. So, ko Papa Whakarito te ingoa o te Pāmu. So, Papa Whakarito is the name of the farm. And it was gifted to the farm, or to the whenua, by Huirangi Waikirepuru, who sadly passed away last year during COVID. And beautiful Taranaki kaumātua. And it was really special to have that name given to us. Also, too, given that a lot of Taranaki whānui people or descendants came down to this area, so kind of settled in this area as well. But it literally means Papa Whakarito, if you break it down, like the foundations, Papa tuanuku, Earth Mother. Whaka means to make, it activates the word. And Rito is the heart of the flax bush. So, and for Māori, the flax bush, there's a lot of proverbs about the flax bush being resemblant or similar to a family structure, or similar to a whānau. So Papa Whakarito just means really nourishing the heart of the flax bush. And so that really is what we do here. We nourish the heart of the whenua, nourish the heart of the awa and the water, but nourish the heart of whānau as well. So the Hua Parakore system was developed by Te Waka Kaiora, the National Māori Organics collective in Aotearoa, and it's the first Indigenous verification system for certifying or verifying pure kai, organic kai, but using Indigenous values, Māori principles and Māori understandings of how to produce natural food. Yeah. So I'm trained as a kaupapa Māori researcher. My background's in environmental studies. Um, and, you know, in Indigenous development and working to transform our communities so that we can live healthier lives in better ways, it's not uncommon for us as Māori, especially as researchers, to get involved in projects which actually deliver wellbeing outcomes within the communities that we work in. So obviously living on a little piece of land is something that is connected with organics and with the kaupapa that we have out here, which is about wellbeing and being interconnected with the whenua and with the river and with the total environment. So I became involved with the Hua Parakore as a researcher on a 3-year research project where we went around the country and we asked Māori communities and Māori traditional healers or practitioners, rongoa practitioners, a really simple question with a scope really big. And the question was, hea hanga kaupapa o te Hua Parakore? What are the principles of Hua Parakore, of pure food? So hua literally means a product and parakore literally means free from rubbish or harm or toxic waste or chemicals. So Hua Parakore, you could understand it in English as organics, but for us we're not using a Western model to try and come back to Indigenous understanding, so it just is Hua Parakore. So I started off as a researcher for 3 years on that project, had the privilege of going around the country and being involved in hui, asking kaumātua communities, Māori organic growers, hea hanga kaupapa o te Hua Parakore, what are the principles of a pure Māori food product for eating? And as you can imagine, the answers across the motu, across the islands, were just really vast and really huge. So we ended up with so much beautiful, rich kōrero, and every principle and value, every tanga, as we might call them, kaitiaki-tanga, manaaki-tanga, rangatira-tanga, every tanga that there was. And so the job really of the research project was to work with our kaumātua and our elders under their guidance to really think about, well, how can we consolidate that understanding or what people are saying into a framework which is accessible for everybody, Māori, non-Māori, Indigenous communities overseas, so that we can provide a different framework, a culturally relevant framework in Aotearoa for thinking about organics or regenerative agriculture or Marakai or food sovereignty or soil sovereignty. So that's really what the Hua Parakore is about. It's a framework now, and it's been picked up by Māori organic growers, it's been picked up by soil scientists, it's been picked up by cooks, by fermenters, so it's used kind of right across the food system as a way to bring Indigenous values into kai. There are some absolute no-goes in the Hua Parakore that are really important for us. We don't use pesticides or chemicals on Earth Mother, on Papa Tuanuku. It's an absolute no-go to genetic modification of any sort or nanotechnology, nanopesticides, you know, any of that synbio, new technologies or convergence technologies. So we really are just talking about working as co-producers and co-creators with nature, with Papa Tuanuku, so that we can fulfil our own creative potential within our well-being. And that really is about connecting with our divine senses. So when we talk about kind of creative potential in relation to food sovereignty, for us on the farm, that is a real outcome, you know, being able to walk on the earth, walk on Hiniahuone, on Papa Tuanuku, and to really have that connection with the divine energies of our atua or of our deity so that we can fulfil our creative potential of who we are as Indigenous peoples. Yeah. So there are 6 kaupapa or 6 principles, Māori principles, that make up the Hua Parakore framework. We have Wairua, spirituality, We have mana, which is about power, authority, prestige. Te ao turoa, the natural world. Whakapapa, which is about genealogical connections. Maori, life-giving energy, maybe sometimes understood as prana or chi. And then Maramataka, the ability to be illuminated or to illuminate in your practice of growing food or animal husbandry or caretaking for water bodies. So it really is this kind of integrated, connected, holistic, Indigenous driven framework for Māori food sovereignty, for Māori soil sovereignty, for Marakai, for thinking about Māori food systems. And I really like to think about it in relationship to the work of Māori Marsden, who wrote a beautiful book called The Woven Universe. And if we think about our world as a woven universe, the Hua Parakore just provides a framework for us to enter into being a part of that woven universe. You know, the woven universe from the sky and the stars that connects down into the microbiology, into the soil, and all we are is we're just a part of that woven universe. We end up being the conduit in lots of ways as the human or as the tangata on the whenua, tangata whenua, people from the land, so we end up being that conduit in our practices of Hua Parakore to kind of balance the polarities between earth and sky. Whakapapa is one of the kaupapa, one of the Māori principles or values of the Hua Parakore, and whakapapa is about genealogical connections. I also do think about it in terms of layering, you know, papa, like to layer things, and so if you think about genealogy in terms of layering, think about knowledge in terms of how we might build knowledge and we layer it up. So whakapapa for me on the whenua firstly is about being really aware that I'm in somebody else's rohi, that I'm in somebody else's tribal lands and I'm a visitor. So I might own the land, not really own the land, but I am definitely a guest in somebody else's tribal area. And I come to that understanding because of the kaupapa or the principle of whakapapa. And so if I'm a guest, then there's certain ways that a guest has to behave in somebody else's land. And the first thing for me is to, one, understand that I am a guest, I am manuhere. And the second thing is to not claim any right that tramples on the mana of the local tribe of this area. Although I am Māori, I am not from this area, so I don't have mana whenua status in this area. I'm here looking after a piece of land, but I don't claim to have kaitiaki status or guardianship status. And I think that's a really important point in Aotearoa. As Māori concepts get picked up and they get co-opted, we see this kind of normalising of these concepts of kaitiakitanga, where everybody claims to be kaitiaki, but actually kaitiakitanga is very strongly connected and tied to those people who have mana in that area, in their rohi. So the kaitiaki of this area are the mana whenua, and we in our whānau are really visitors to a beautiful piece of land in somebody else's tribal territories that we are caring for it as best as we can. Yeah. So the other thing for me around whakapapa being a gardener or working the mara is thinking about where seeds come from and ensuring that we understand the whakapapa or the genealogy of seeds. And for Hua Parakore growers, this is really important. We do lots of seed swapping and we're, working to ensure that we're rebuilding our traditional seed stock, that the stories attached to seeds move with the seeds as well. So it's not just like the physical object of the seed, which is one thing, but it's actually the whole kōrero of the seed that needs to come with it as well. So whakapapa is one of the first principles that we need to think about when we're talking about Hua Parakore, especially when we have aspirations to be on pieces of land, to be on whenua, to think about what our standpoint is and what our positioning is. I think it's really important, especially in settler colonial nations like Aotearoa and with colonisation, that we have to really deliberately understand that we are on Māori land. And I often pose this question, and I think it's relevant all across Aotearoa, and often Pākehā say, where's our role in the Hua Parakore? Well, my first question back, or my response back, is where do you stand on Māori land? So where do you stand? What is your standpoint? What are your politics? What are your values? It changes up the mindset, and it stops the erasure of the previous, the current, but often invisible Indigenous occupants of those territories. Yeah. One of the other kaupapa of the Hua Parakore is Te Ao Turoa, and Te Ao Turoa refers to the natural world. And it's a really important kaupapa because it holds the woven universe concept, and it holds the indivisible relationships between people, whenua, water, air, everything. And I mean, it's easy to say we're interconnected, and an Indigenous worldview is interconnected. But actually we need to really feel that interconnectedness. And so Te Ao Turoa is like the entry point for us as tangata, as humans, to really feel that interconnectedness with that whole woven universe. So what it means from a growing perspective, or from a farming perspective, is that we are treating the farm as one whole organism. And this is really similar to biodynamics, where you look at the farm as a whole organism, or as a whole being, as a whole entity, not as a raised bed, a paddock over there, wood lot there. This is a whole ecosystem. And so then how do I look after, connect up, enhance the fungi moving through the whole ecosystem? How do I connect up the energy of the stars raining down? How do I kind of diffuse that energy across the whole entity of the ecosystem of the farm? So Te Ao Turoa, natural world. So one of the other kaupapa is Māori, and Māori is often understood as life force or energy, prana, chi, and something for me that's really tangible in terms of what we do on the farm. And it's often used in environmental management, or in Māori environmental management, as an environmental performance indicator. So we understand the well-being of the natural environment by understanding the well-being or the health of the Māori. And so we can talk about the Māori of the awa, the pākuratahi awa that runs through the farm. And, we understand that through observation, through just by having a close relationship with the awa and taking the dog for a walk down it, and being able to see the changes and notice what's happening. So there's, we have observational skills to understand Māori. But one of the other ways that we enhance the practice of Māori, or uplift Māori on the farm, is through composting. And so we are really deliberate in our composting practices on the farm, and really growing soil and growing microbiology, and sharing that vibrant life force around the farm with biodynamic preparations in it that have brought down the energies of the stars and connected up the energies through the soil, and having those preparations in the compost, and then spreading that throughout the farm or throughout the food, is a way of sharing that Māori, or that energy, both around the farm, but also too then you're going to eat that food, and so then we take that Māori into ourselves. So it's a beautiful closed loop in some ways, Māori, if you're really thinking about enhancing Māori practices. And what I really like about it is it takes us away from that scientific realm, thinking about what's the pH of the soil. I'm more like, take your shoes off, put your hands in, how does it feel, what does it smell like, mush it between your fingers, what can you see in it, close your eyes, stand on the earth for a few minutes, how's it really feeling? And so it's, the practice of Māori is a deep opportunity to be able to connect back with our divine senses, to connect back with the whenua as our atua, as our deity, as our primal parents. So one of the other practices for enhancing Māori is working with the Maramataka, so the Māori moon calendar. And so again, this is a active, ensuring balance, working in a way where we can bring balance to the ecosystem. And so being able to work with the Maramataka through enhancing the balance of the ecosystem is another way to uplift the mode of the entity of the farm or the mara or what you're working with. Maramataka is one of my favourite kaupapa to work with, and can be a little bit hard to unpack it and to explain it. Maramataka, it's almost like that illumination, that coming to know, that moment of enlightenment or knowingness within the garden, within the mara or within nature. And our kaumātua talk about our divine senses and our intuitive knowing. And Maramataka uplifts that. It lifts the mana of actually connecting with our divine senses. So how do we feel when we're in the garden or when we're in the river or when we're on the farm? How do we feel when we're applying compost? Percy, who was the kaumātua of Te Waka Kaiora, used to talk about it in terms of your puku. What are you feeling in your stomach or even in your ati, in your liver, what do you feel in your organs through the food that you're producing or through how you're producing it. So, yeah, Maramataka. Yeah, I do understand Maramataka through our practices of biodynamics and definitely through the application of 500. When we are broadcasting 500 over the farm, you're broadcasting it beginning the arc of the movement where you've got the 500 preparation on the hand brush, beginning that arc of that movement down at Papatūānuku, down at the earth, and then taking that brush and that arc all the way up to the stars, up to the sky. And so, you're creating that balancing or that energetic connection there between land and sky. And when one of our kaumātua, Percy, asked me about Maramataka, he said, how do you understand it? And I said, well, I understand it really through biodynamics, through the application of 500, because we create, it's almost like this farm, Papa Whakarito has its own energy field around it. And really having a connection with your divine senses enables you really to connect with that energetic understanding of what's happening on the farm. And the practice of biodynamics over many years builds that inside yourself. You see things in a different way, you feel things, you hear things, you smell things in a different way. So it really is about coming back to trust ourselves. And I think coming back to trust ourselves as nature beings. And one of the main things in the Hua Parakore is seeing ourselves not as separate from nature but as part of nature. So I think if we take that understanding and if we understand that through the lens of Maramataka, then actually we are just all, the illumination there is that we are a nature being. There is no hierarchy. Our job is to slip in, to tread lightly. And for me, Maramataka is a validation that it's absolutely okay in Māori ways to think that way. And that's what the Hua Parakore framework does. And what I think one of the real values of it is that it validates Indigenous Māori knowing of how to be on the whenua, to grow food, produce food for family, and to look after land in a way that, one, feeds us, so we've got food security, but it also too creates well-being because we can come to know ourselves in a different way through our divine senses, which is very different. We feel very blessed that we're on a piece of land, and that's very different for people who live in urban environments. And so it's just, then we need to think about other ways that people in urban environments can connect with their own divine senses. And one of the practices or one of the Hua Parakore ways of doing that is actually mindfulness around eating. And so we can slow down when we eat. We can chew our food more when we eat. We can eat in silence and be really mindful about it, and then we can engage with the food and the whenua and the land and the water from where that food has come from. So, we just have to, there's lots of flexibility. The Hua Parakore framework just provides multiple Indigenous pathways of knowing to be able to express ourselves through food. Mana is one of the other kaupapa or principles of the Hua Parakore system, and mana is about prestige, authority, power, and really the act of growing food and feeding other people is a real mana enhancing act to undertake. And so that's the act of manaakitanga. And so it's really important to us on the farm that we feed people when they come. It's really important that we feed people food from the garden. So the act of growing food in abundance is an expression of the kaupapa or the principle of mana. One of the other aspects of mana is that it provides a pathway in for us to think about the global food system and what's happening in the global food system, and how as Indigenous peoples we exercise our power, our own self-determination, our own tino rangatiratanga within that food system. And so, you know, the best way for us to do that is actually to opt out of that global capitalist food system. So one of the other important aspects of mana is that it provides a pathway for us to think about how we can exercise our self-determination and our political rights within that context of the global food system. And so the way that global capital circulates very much follows the way that the global food system circulates. And as Indigenous peoples talking about food sovereignty or food security, our job really is to opt out of that system and to start to build our own Indigenous Māori food systems where we can close the loop and we can feed our own communities. And I think about that for us as Māori people as returning to eat the cultural landscapes from which we come from. Yeah. So Wairua can be understood, I understand it as truth, morality, serenity, calmness, state of being, two waters coming together. And Wairua sometimes can be understood as spirituality, but for me that doesn't really embody what Wairua is. And Wairua is an important kaupapa of the Hua Parakore because it gives us this understanding that we come onto the whenua with the gentleness in our spirit and who we are, that we don't come onto the land and to go hard, to make money, to push you to the, you know, furthest extent of producing the maximum yield of something. And in doing that, again, that nurtures that relationship that we talked about earlier with te ao turoa and being part of the natural environment and being in balance with it. And so Wairua, if we're working with Wairua as a kaupapa in the Hua Parakore, it's really about maintaining a sense of harmony, a sense of peace and a sense of safety within our Marakai practices. So the Hua Parakore sits within a Māori worldview, and I understand that through the work of Māori Marsden and through the way that we live at the farm, but this idea of the woven universe where everything is interconnected from land to stars to sky, everything is interconnected, and there's a really delicate balance within that interconnectedness that needs to be maintained. And so we have an understanding of what that Māori worldview is, but we don't live in that balance, in that way with the environment anymore since colonisation. So part of the work of the Hua Parakore is helping to restore that balance within that worldview. So that worldview is interconnected, it's holistic, it doesn't privilege humans over nature, so we are a part of nature. And right at the heart of that worldview is this notion of whanau and whanaungatanga, this notion of interconnectedness, of whakapapa, this notion of wairua, of spirituality, of centeredness, of calmness, and this notion of Maramataka, kind of this illumination. So we can actually use the Hua Parakore principles or values to help us think about what that worldview is. Something that's really important to understand about the Māori worldview is that it is a complete and valid way of living as Māori and of understanding the world. And one of the impacts of colonisation for Indigenous peoples all over the world was that our knowledges were seen as primitive, as savage, as naive, as not worthy, as not scientific. But we have hundreds of years of scientific knowledge as Māori through intergenerational observation and practices of gathering and collecting kai moana or kai from the environment. We have hundreds of years of experience of living from rākau Māori, from manu, from the whenua, from the awa, and still maintaining that balance. So it's not a theoretical concept framing of the Māori, framing of the natural world for Māori. It's actually a lived reality for us, and we're living it every day. And what's been wonderful since what many would call the Māori Renaissance in the 1970s and the rise of Māori political activism is that Māori worldview has been legitimised. And so now we actually see in Aotearoa Māori worldviews and concepts like Māori being used to measure the state of the environment, to help us understand about the well-being of what's around us in the everyday. And that's really important when, as an Indigenous person, your own knowledges and the way that you think and feel and embody and who you are in yourself actually is validated. Yeah. The Hua Parakore differs from the other current 4 organic verification schemes in New Zealand because it's Māori, because it provides an Indigenous pathway, a kaupapa Māori pathway for Māori growers to tell a Māori story about their food production. And that is so important. And I think it's a real mark of colonisation and settler colonialism in Aotearoa that it's taken until 2011 for us to have any kaupapa Māori pathway to tell an organic story. Currently having a change in our regulatory system around organic certification, where government has a bill before the House called the Organic Products Bill, and it's proposing to have government end-to-end certification of organic standards. So that's just another job for the Māori Organics Group to have to engage with government organisations to see how our system can fit into that. So, yeah. So one of the other clear differentials between the Hua Parakore system and the other organic systems is we have very clear tikanga around the use of human waste on food or in mara or in composting. And so it's not permittable in a Hua Parakore system to use human waste. For example, we have a composting loo system here, and we don't put any of that human waste into any of the food garden at all. And so for us on the farm, building the house and laying down the compost loo and the worm bath, which everything goes to, was a really important consideration about the placement of that in relation to the mara and where the pipes go. And that's just about that's just a cultural difference for us. Whereas I know in permaculture and in other types of systems that human waste is seen as a resource through through decomposition, but in the Hua Parakore, it's not something that we would do. Yeah. The process for the Hua Parakore is kaupapa Māori driven, so it's really relational. And having been both certified organic with Organic Farm NZ, which is a small organic certification scheme for small farms in New Zealand, and then also too being Hua Parakore verified, there's just stark differences in the processes between Hua Parakore and the other Western certification systems. And an example of that is in Western organic certification systems, I fill out paperwork, send off an email, an auditor comes out, I might be a different auditor from year to year. It's on the farm for 3 or 4 hours, he or she's read the paperwork, and then we go for a walk around the farm and they've gone. But with the Hua Parakore, we're actually about building communities and building communities which are resilient, which are transformational. And so when this farm received its full Hua Parakore verification, we had a hui of about 60 to 70 people up here, and it was really kind of like almost gaining collective consent. You know, we walked around the farm, we had people from the Māori Organics group with us who asked questions in relation to the kaupapa. And then we had other Māori people there steeped in Matauranga Māori and te reo who were also too asking us questions. And so in lots of ways it's a learning framework. We get to ask these questions and we get to respond, but then other people who have come to that hui or that final verification get to add their whakaaro or their thoughts as well. So for example, I was asked, and I mentioned this earlier, how do I experience Maramataka on the farm? And so I responded and gave my answer to that. But then, you know, there were a whole lot of other people around as well. They're having an experience on the farm. And so, you know, the question was thrown open to other people as well. How are you experiencing Maramataka? And what that does then is it gives us other language, other ideas, other understandings from other people around how Maramataka might be being experienced on the farm. So Indigenous knowledge isn't a static knowledge, you know, it's always developing and evolving. And what's fantastic about the Hua Parakore framework is that it allows Indigenous knowledge in relation to food sovereignty, Māori, agriculture, horticulture, to just keep extending and keep extending in a very collectivised and very Indigenous way. So when we first bought the farm 16 years ago, I was really excited about coming onto a piece of whenua, but I hadn't really worked on a farm before or regenerated a piece of land before or worked with animals before. So I went off and did a course in biodynamics and organic agriculture at Turoa College in Napier, and just learnt so much and was thrown into my eyes were just opened into this whole other world of how to restore balance within the land and how to farm in a way which absolutely enhances the mode of every organism within the farm. And so biodynamics for me it's almost like a sacred practice. It's a little bit like a yoga practice where it feels, you know, where you really do become the conduit between the earth and the stars to be able to create that balance. And so we use biodynamic preparations. We use preparation 500, which is cow manure mixed up in a bucket or dynamised in a bucket through creating vortexes, and the way that you stir one way and then break the vortex and stir around the other way. So you're kind of creating chaos and then, you know, breaking that, you know, creating a vortex and then breaking that vortex and then creating chaos, letting that chaos spin for a bit and then creating that vortex round the other way and then letting go of that and putting your hand in and creating chaos again. While the whole time you've got a handful of that 500 preparation in there, which has been in the ground for 6 months, buried in a cow horn. And so there's a really balancing process and having a connection. And I'm not even going to try and unpack the science of any of this, because it's really, for me, it's about my intuitive knowing around what I'm doing is really healing for the land. But it's also too really healing for me as somebody who walks around the land and actually gets to apply the 500. I know I'm doing no harm. I know that I'm bringing the sacred energies of the cow onto the land, and for me that has a connection back with my Indian side as well, with the cow being so sacred, and also to our, you know, champions of biodynamics in New Zealand. I've spent a lot of time in India, and so biodynamics has really been picked up in India as well. We also use biodynamic preparations in the compost, so that's another way to really spread that modi or take that energetic field of those 5 preparations in the compost over across the whenua. So for me, there's a lot of similarities between biodynamics and the Hua Parakore, and they just fit for us on the land. And our kaumatua always said to us in the development of the Hua Parakore system, they were never closed off. That, you know, they never said Pākehā can't be Hua Parakore. Pākehā need to partner with Māori, need to, you know, you obviously need to have relationships with mana whenua in your area if you want to be Hua Parakore verified, because it's the local communities who come together to verify you. So, you know, there's protection mechanisms in there for co-option, I suppose, which is really, really important, yeah. So, Māori soil sovereignty is about making that connection between healthy soils and healthy people. And if we think about healthy soil, we've got a really healthy microbiology within that soil. We've got living fungi stretching out. We've got sugars moving around in the soils. And I take that image into then thinking about what's happening in our gut, in our human health. So the idea of what's happening in the soil is actually needs to be mirrored in terms of what's happening in our gut health as well. So if we're growing our soil through composting, through good soil practices, crop rotation, you know, not leaving soil bare to get dried out by the sun or eroded by the rain, but if we've got really good soil practices, soil health practices, and then we're growing food and then we're eating that food, then that's going to contribute to really good gut health. So there's a link that I don't think we make very often when we think about well-being between healthy soils and healthy people. And a lot of the work of the Soil and Health Association is all about making that connection between healthy soils and healthy people. Food is the thing that grows on top of the ground most of the time, unless we're talking about root vegetables, but actually everything starts in the soil. So one of the other connections between healthy soil and healthy people is actually having people return, having Māori return to the relationship that we have with our divine ancestor, Hiniahone. So if as Māori we can begin to restore that relationship with our tūpuna, with our ancestor, if we can begin to elevate the mana of her, elevate the mana of soil, elevate the mana of Hiniahone, then that relationship, that practice of elevating the mana is actually mana enhancing not just for Hiniahone, but it's mana enhancing for us as the person or as the people, as the whanau, as the community who have engaged in those practices, those relationship practices of restoring and rebuilding our relationship back with our tūpuna, back with our ancestor. The term Māori food sovereignty for me means returning to eat our cultural landscapes from which we came from, and being able to have the autonomy and the right to be able to do that, and also to being able to have the absolute abundance within that natural cultural landscape to be able to do that, and lastly being able to have the knowledge within our communities to be able to do that. So there's a whole lot of layers in there, and it's a lifetime's work or commitment to a practice. Māori food sovereignty isn't something that we achieve as a one-off. It really is a way of life. It's about connecting with our food system. It's about understanding our food system. It's about activating our politics around the global food system and about demonstrating resistance to genetic engineering, to nanopesticides, nanotechnologies, synbio. It's about engaging again with kind of diverse local economies so that we can restore and rebuild the food systems from which our tūpuna lived and from which we come from. Yeah. I think one of the other important aspects of Māori food sovereignty is that we have to enact food sovereignty within communities. Kai is never something that's just an individual act. Although we eat individually as human beings, I think we all have the experience when we share a celebratory meal with neighbours, within community, with family, with whānau, that actually there's a well-being aspect to that. And Māori food sovereignty, yes, it's about whole water, and yes, it's about well-being, but it's actually about restoring food as an act that we do within communities, and that's really, really important, yeah. So one of the impacts of colonisation for Māori communities has been the disruption and the removal of us from our traditional food systems. For example, a lot of our natural areas are tied up in the conservation estate in Aotearoa, and which fall under the Wildlife Act, which actually prevent Māori from entering the conservation estate to wild harvest food. Manu, rākau, soils, you have to apply for permits to be able to do that. So for me, that doesn't represent a form of sovereignty. We do not have agency or self-determination or tino rangatiratanga in that regard. We have to apply to the government, the colonising power, to apply for permission to be able to do that. So we need to be able to, in Māori food sovereignty, return to the cultural landscapes from which we have come from. But it's not as simple as that when we live in a settler colonial reality with global pressures. And so being able to return to those cultural landscapes, we actually have to rebuild those cultural landscapes. And that's what many Māori communities and many whanau and hapu marae are doing around the country, is that they are actually rebuilding their cultural landscapes. They are relearning about some of those traditional foods and those fermentation methods for storing food, which of course create really good gut health. So we've got some, traditional foods that actually were really good for us, are really good for us, that we need to come back into our diet. I mean, one of the impacts of colonisation has been the colonisation of our diet. And so we've been removed from these types of food. Often talk about having a colonised puku or colonised taste buds. Kina are not my favourite, but for many people they are. I didn't grow up eating fermented corn or rotten corn, but for a lot of people they did. And so, this is this thing about, I'm sure inside my divine senses and my tupuna, my ancestral lines, that I can reconnect with those energies or those divine understandings again to be able to reclaim that. So there's lots of layers to Māori food sovereignty. One, it's on that personal level of actually, needing to decolonise our food system and our gut and the way that we approach food. But it's also too at a systems level within community, rebuilding our cultural landscapes. And then of course it's at that political level, which is really important, that we can activate at that political level to push against all of those colonising multinational global forces that we actually have very little control over through free trade agreements and multilateral agreements that bring a whole lot of things into New Zealand and set regulations for how we should farm and how we should produce food. So many levels, personal, community and that political level are all the levels that we need to activate Māori food sovereignty. So the Hua Parakore framework is a framework that can be applied to help us think about Māori food sovereignty. And I think about the kaupapa of mana, and about mana being about agency and self-determination. So if we think about that in relation to Māori food sovereignty, it's really about having choices. Having choices in terms of, well, first off, socioeconomically, that we actually have the ability to go and buy food. And so that obviously raises a lot of issues around poverty and food security. But it's also too about being able to have the choices in a Māori food sovereignty framework, being able to have the choices to go down to the river and to put a hinaki in there and to actually have an abundance of tuna or eels in the river for harvest, for smoking, for eating, for preserving, for sharing. And so Māori food sovereignty is about having all of those choices, not just at an individual level, but at a whanau level, at a community level as well. So for Māori whanau, Māori communities, Māori farmers or growers who want to connect in with the Hua Parakore, really the first port of call is to get in contact with Te Waka Kaiora, with the National Māori Organics Group. And there's a really clear process for becoming Hua Parakore verified. And like organics, because it does take a certain amount of time to transition, it takes a full 3 years to become Hua Parakore verified. And it's a community process. You know, we're bringing people along with us. We're strengthening our own knowledge systems. We're building our own ways and understandings of how to be growers within our own cultural practices to tell our own kaupapa Māori stories in Aotearoa. So people often ask what's the role of Pākehā in Hua Parakore, and it's a really good question. It was a question that came up for us as Māori researchers on the project as well. And our kaumātua, we're very clear that the Hua Parakore is not about excluding people. And if we think about Māori worldviews as being interconnective and inclusive, and the notion of whakapapa as moving out, you know, and bringing people in, that's really what we're wanting to do in the Hua Parakore. You know, we've got a vision for Aotearoa of having Hua Parakore farms and food producers all across the country connecting up and returning us back to eat our cultural landscapes again. So there's room for Pākehā to become Hua Parakore verified, but you have to walk alongside us and we need to walk alongside you. So you need to be shepherded through the process, you need to be connected in with Māori communities within your area, and you need to be connected in with Te Waka Kaiora. So, you know, again, we're not about, and Māori knowledge systems and whakapapa is not about this very reductive understanding of the world where we shut things down and say, oh, this is ours, this is ours, this is our way of knowing. The Hua Parakore framework and way of being is a healing way of being. And so really we want to bring as many people into it as we can. Pākehā can support Māori food sovereignty by becoming really strong allies. And that's not just in food sovereignty, that's in ngā mea katoa, in everything. To become good treaty partners, to become tangata tiriti in Aotearoa is a really important role for Pākehā to take. So first and foremost, understanding where you stand on Māori land, your standpoint and your positionality is really important. So that would be the first thing. And the second thing is look for what is already happening within your local community. Where is the local marae? What help does the marae need in terms of marakai? Have you made a relationship with your local community, local Māori community or kohanga reo? I think sometimes we think we often need to go out and start something new or have a new idea and get some funding and get a whole new group of people together in order to be able to support. But actually there's enough initiatives that are going on in Te Ao Māori right now that could really be strengthened with the support of Pākehā allies. And a really exciting example of that is the work at Papatūānuku Marae and the fish head program that's going on up there. And so the fish heads and other byproducts of fishing, you know, that never went to market, that were deemed waste. The fishing community then got in contact with the marae because they've got big marae gardens and they're out in South Auckland. And so those fish heads get taken to the marae and whanau come and get the fish heads and take them home and cook them up. And so it's a really great way to, one, strengthen the community, strengthen the relationship between the community and the marae and between yourself as a Pākehā ally and the marae and the community and that type of program. So I think we have too many good things that are happening, which kind of sounds like, oh, how could you have too many good things that are happening? But we diffuse the energy of it. And so how can we actually strengthen what's already happening in place? And that's really important. You know, understanding your place, where you stand, how you can strengthen what's going on within your local community around Māori food sovereignty initiatives is that first port of call for Pākehā being allies and being tangata tiriti. The Hua Parakore has relevance for people all around the world because I think what it illuminates is that there's other ways of knowing, other ways of being in food production and in being on the land. And so what we're able to do in Aotearoa through the work that we're doing in the Māori Organics group and the Māori growers and Hua Parakore growers and producers are doing is we're able to say, we have our own traditional knowledges and our own customs and our own tikanga for producing food in ways that enhance our relationship with nature, that help restore that relationship with nature. And so for people in other parts of the world, an appreciation for knowing that there's other ways of knowing is enough. You know, having empathy for other ways of knowing is enough. And coming away from or breaking away from that dominance of Western knowledge and Western science as being the predominant way, the all-being way of knowing, you know, which really colonisation has layered over Indigenous peoples everywhere. You know, Indigenous knowledges were erased and eroded everywhere around the world, and they're being recovered really slowly, and our knowledges are being elevated, and we're doing it ourselves through research work, through writing, through putting it into practice, through taking these practices into communities. We're just elevating it. We're just doing it. It's getting validated in the doing of it. So it's not, Hua Parakore isn't a knowledge system which is up for debate. It is, and it just is, and it's here, and we're doing it, and that's what Māori communities are activating around Aotearoa. And I think that that's really important, yeah. There isn't necessarily anything active that's needed from non-Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world to support the Hua Parakore movement, but there is a need for compassion for other ways of knowing, and there is a need to make space for other ways of knowing. So again, it is about removing and pushing back that dominance of Western knowledge systems to allow for Indigenous ways of knowing as being valid in terms of how we produce food. Yeah. Key aspect of Māori food sovereignty is also to the connection between seed sovereignty. And so who has the right to save seeds, especially from rākau Māori, from our native trees, but also too from our traditional kai. And so it's a little bit for me like being very clear that I'm a visitor on somebody else in somebody else's tribal area. And so I don't assume that I have any kaitiaki status or right over any of the native seeds within this area. And so really the mana, and coming back to one of those values or principles of the Hua Parakore, the mana to be able to save seeds in the area that I live in, first and foremost belongs to mana whenua. One of the key initiatives that I believe really needs to happen is we need to have Indigenous seed bank, an Indigenous-led and run, a Māori-run seed bank in Aotearoa, both for marakai, both for our traditional foods, like our corns and our kamo, but also too for our native seeds as well. And so we need to think about the role of paternalism in here when we have non-Māori people or communities saving seeds that traditionally are cultural foods of Māori communities. And so I would say that that's an extension of colonisation, and that actually that right needs to be returned back, that mana needs to be restored back with Māori communities to be the holders of those seeds. And so we need to think and we need to collectivise, both as whanau and hapu and iwi, but also too nationally as Māori, ways that we can actually save our seeds. And we're well positioned in Aotearoa if we close our gates to GE to actually become a really important island nation for the rest of the world, to have non-contaminated GE seed stock in Aotearoa that could actually supply many other parts of the world. Māori seed sovereignty is a key tenet of Māori food sovereignty, and it's really important that Māori have the ability, or the rangatiratanga, the mana, to be able to save seeds, both for our native trees, for our rākau Māori and for our kai Māori, at a whānau level, at a hapu level, at an iwi level, and then even at a national level. So it is our self-determining right as Māori to caretake for our own seed stock in Aotearoa. And we need to shine a really urgent light on that. We've got real potential in Aotearoa being an island nation, as we have found when we've closed our borders to COVID, that that's a great strength for us, but it's also to a great strength for us in terms of being a really important seed producing nation for the rest of the world. Close our borders to GE and GE seeds, and we could be producing seed stock that could actually help to feed the rest of the world. And that's a really deliberate act of Māori food sovereignty, because that's a way to subvert the 5 multinational companies that own and have the patents over the seeds that are dominant within the global food system. And so saving seeds at a local level and then trying to create that ripple out, so it's whanau and then it's hapu and then it's iwi, and at a national level has real potential within a Māori food sovereignty framework.